Kieran strolled into the campus library like he owned the place, hands tucked in the pockets of his leather jacket. Lisa had casually mentioned earlier that Ian loved to spend hours buried in books, often retreating to the quietest corners of the library. Smirking to himself, Kieran pulled out a stack of brightly colored sticky notes. He had spent most of the previous night writing overly dramatic confessions of love, complete with quotes from the cheesiest romance dramas he could find. If Ian thought his flirting was ridiculous before, this would take things to a whole new level. "My love for you is like the stars, distant but eternal," Kieran whispered to himself as he slid a note into a thick psychology textbook. He grinned. "Oh, that's gold." Each note got progressively more absurd. "If you won't take responsibility for my heart, then at least return it in mint condition. Your glare pierces my soul, Ian. Keep staring. I need the motivation. Your handwriting is sexier than my ex's entire personality." Hours later, Ian discovered the first note. He blinked, rereading the words 3 times before crumpling it and stuffing it into his bag. The second note appeared 2 chapters later, causing Ian to sigh audibly, much to the annoyance of the other library patrons. By the time he got to the 5th note, Ian had had enough. "Kieran!" Ian snapped, standing in front of Kieran's usual cafe table later that afternoon, holding a pile of colorful sticky notes like they were incriminating evidence. Kieran looked up innocently. "Oh, hey, babe, what's up?" "Are these yours?" Ian practically growled, holding them up like a lawyer presenting Exhibit A. Kieran didn't even hesitate. "Do they make you smile? Then yeah, they're mine." Ian's glare was icy, but Kieran noticed the faintest twitch at the corner of his lips. "You're impossible." "And yet, you're still here," Kieran countered, resting his chin in his hand. "Come on, admit it. It's cute." Ian stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. "You're delusional." "That's not a no," Kieran called after him as Ian left. For his next move, Kieran decided to up the ante. Nothing said hopeless romantic like a public serenade, right? He'd even planned the perfect moment, outside Ian's lecture hall during the lunch break, when he was sure the courtyard would be buzzing with students. Kieran enlisted a guitarist friend to accompany him, and chose the sappiest ballad he could find. As Ian exited the lecture hall, surrounded by a sea of students, Kieran stepped forward dramatically. "Ian Reed," Kieran began, his voice carrying over the chatter. "This one's for you." Before Ian could stop him, the guitar started strumming, and Kieran launched into a heartfelt rendition of a popular romance drama theme song. The lyrics, dripping with over-the-top devotion, made students around him pause to watch the unfolding spectacle. Some even pulled out their phones to record. Ian froze, his face cycling through disbelief, embarrassment, and thinly veiled amusement. He covered his face with one hand, muttering something Kieran couldn't hear. By the second verse, campus security approached. "Kieran Holt," one of the guards said in a tired voice. "We've talked about this." "Oh, come on," Kieran protested as his guitar player smothered a laugh. "I'm wooing my future boyfriend here." "Not on campus property, you're not," the guard replied, gesturing for him to move along. The crowd dispersed as security escorted Kieran off the premises, Ian shaking his head as he walked in the opposite direction. But Kieran noticed the small, reluctant smile Ian tried to hide as he disappeared into the crowd. Undeterred, Kieran crafted his next move, a classic meet cute, straight from his beloved BL dramas. Lisa had informed him that Ian was attending a small seminar that week, and Kieran made it his mission to accidentally on purpose bump into him there. The room was packed when Kieran arrived, acting as if he had no idea Ian would be there. He spotted Ian sitting near the back, engrossed in his notebook. With a carefully executed stumble, Kieran made his way over and accidentally spilled his coffee onto his own notes. "Oh no, my dissertation!" Kieran exclaimed, loud enough for Ian to hear. Ian looked up, deadpan. "You don't even have a dissertation." "Details," Kieran said, dropping into the seat beside him. "What are you doing here, babe? Miss me already?" Ian sighed deeply. "We're at a public seminar. Stop calling me that." "But it suits you so well," Kieran teased, leaning closer. "Don't you think?" Ian turned back to his notes, ignoring him. Kieran leaned back, satisfied. One day, Ian wouldn't be able to hide the smile Kieran was so sure he was suppressing. Later that evening, Kieran caught up with Lisa, who had been quietly cheering him on from the sidelines. "I can't believe you actually sang for him," Lisa said, laughing so hard she nearly spilled her bubble tea. "You're insane." Kieran shrugged, grinning. "Insanely romantic, you mean?" "You're something, all right," Lisa said, her voice warm. "You know, for all your theatrics, I can tell you really like him. It's kind of sweet." Kieran's grin softened. "He's worth it, Lisa, even if he's a little prickly." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "A little?" "Okay, a lot," Kieran admitted, "but it's part of his charm." After yet another outrageous stunt, a surprise cupcake delivery to Ian's office with icing that spelled out "Date me," Ian finally snapped. "Kieran," Ian said sharply, cornering him outside the cafe where they often crossed paths. "Enough. You're ridiculous." "I know," Kieran said, completely unrepentant, "but it's working." "It's not," Ian countered, but his expression betrayed his words. "Then why are you still talking to me?" Kieran shot back, his smile never wavering. Ian opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly frustrated. Finally, he sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Fine," Ian said at last. "One date, but you have to promise me something." "Anything," Kieran replied, eyes gleaming with victory. "No more cheesy tactics," Ian said firmly. "No serenades, no notes, no whatever it is you think you're doing." Kieran grinned. "So you're saying I should just rely on my natural charm?" Ian groaned. "I already regret this." As Ian walked away, Kieran called after him, "You won't regret it, babe. I'll make sure of it." Lisa, who had witnessed the entire exchange from a distance, shook her head with a smile. "You really are something, Kieran." The first date. Kieran couldn't wipe the grin off his face for the rest of the evening. Ian had agreed to a date, an actual, real date. And though the condition was clear, no theatrics, Kieran was already scheming ways to make it unforgettable. After all, love always triumphed in the end. Kieran Holt wasn't nervous. At least that's what he told himself as he checked his reflection in the gleaming glass of the restaurant's window for the third time. This wasn't like him. Confidence was his default setting. Yet the idea of sitting across from Ian Reed without his usual antics felt more nerve-wracking than serenading him in front of half the university. "Okay, Holt," he muttered, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "No theatrics. Just charm." The restaurant was high-end but not pretentious, with its modern decor and intimate lighting casting a warm golden glow across each table. It had taken Kieran weeks to convince Ian to meet him here, and he intended to make every moment count. When Ian arrived, Kieran couldn't stop his appreciative once-over. Ian looked effortlessly put together in a simple navy sweater and black slacks, his hair slightly tousled as if he had debated showing up, but decided to anyway. "You clean up well, babe," Kieran greeted with his signature smirk as Ian slid into the seat across from him. "I already regret this," Ian said, but his tone lacked the usual sharpness, and a hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "You keep saying that," Kieran replied, leaning forward. "But here you are. It's almost like you like spending time with me." Ian rolled his eyes, but the faint pink dusting his cheeks didn't escape Kieran's notice. Despite his usual inclination toward dramatics, Kieran dialed it back tonight. For once, he focused on making Ian feel at ease. They started with light conversation. Classes, books, random anecdotes. Kieran used every bit of his natural charm to coax Ian into relaxing. "And then," Kieran said, laughing, "I found out the library security guard is the guitarist I hired for the serenade. He threatened to ban me if I ever pulled that stunt again." Ian chuckled despite himself, shaking his head. "You really have no sense of shame, do you?" "Not when it comes to you," Kieran shot back, his grin softening. "But tonight, no theatrics. Just us." Ian glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. For the first time, Kieran wasn't performing. He was simply being present, and Ian found himself drawn in despite his reservations. As the evening progressed, Ian began to open up, little by little. Kieran listened intently, asking questions without pushing too hard. It was during dessert that Ian, his gaze fixed on his glass of wine, let slip a piece of the past that had been holding him back. "My last relationship," Ian said slowly, "didn't end well." Kieran remained quiet, giving Ian the space to continue. "He cheated on me," Ian admitted, his voice steady but tinged with lingering hurt. "I didn't even see it coming. It made me question everything. About myself, about trusting people." Kieran's expression softened. "Ian, I'm sorry you went through that. No one deserves to feel like that." Ian met his gaze, surprised by the raw honesty in Kieran's words. "For what it's worth," Kieran added gently, "I'm not him. I'd never hurt you like that." There was a long pause, the air between them thick with unspoken emotion. Ian looked away first, but not before Kieran caught the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. As they finished their meal, the mood lightened. Ian surprised Kieran by recounting a funny story from his childhood about getting lost in a corn maze, only to end up befriending the dog that found him. "So let me get this straight," Kieran teased. "You bonded with a rescue dog while your family was frantically searching for you? That's the most Ian thing I've ever heard." Ian rolled his eyes, but couldn't suppress a chuckle. "What's that supposed to mean?" "That you're stubborn, independent, and secretly a softie," Kieran said, his tone playful but laced with affection. Ian's lips twitched. "You're insufferable. And yet," Kieran quipped, leaning closer, "you're still here." For once, Ian didn't have a comeback. Instead, he held Kieran's gaze a little longer than necessary, the unspoken tension between them crackling like electricity. After dinner, Kieran offered to drive Ian back to his dorm. The car ride was quieter than their usual banter, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The air was heavy with the sense that something significant had shifted between them. When they arrived, Kieran turned off the engine and turned to Ian. "I had a great time tonight," he said, his voice softer than usual. Ian hesitated, as if he was debating whether or not to speak. Finally, he replied, "Me too." Kieran smiled. "You know, you're not half as intimidating as you think you are." "Don't get used to it," Ian warned, though there was no real bite in his tone. Kieran tilted his head, his expression shifting into something more serious. "I'm going to kiss you in a minute. Now's your chance to leave if you don't want that." Ian froze, his breath hitching slightly. Kieran held the moment, not moving any closer, giving Ian all the control. The ball was in Ian's court. After what felt like an eternity, Ian leaned in, brushing his lips softly against Kieran's. The kiss was fleeting, gentle, but it sent a shockwave through both of them. Before Kieran could react, Ian pulled back, his cheeks flushed. "Good night, Kieran," Ian said quickly, practically fleeing the car and disappearing into the dorm building. Kieran sat back, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face as he replayed the kiss in his mind. Sure, Ian had bolted faster than a scared rabbit, but the kiss told him everything he needed to know. "I told you, love always triumphs in the end," Kieran murmured to himself, starting the car. And as he drove away, he couldn't help but think that tonight had been the first step toward something real. Something worth fighting for. Kieran's persistence was beginning to pay off. After their first date and that fleeting kiss, Ian seemed to let down his walls bit by bit, and they started spending more time together. Though Ian was still reserved, there was no denying that something had shifted between them. Kieran, ever the opportunist, made it his mission to coax Ian further out of his shell. One crisp autumn afternoon, Kieran and Ian found themselves in the university library. Ian was diligently working on his research paper, his brow furrowed in concentration, while Kieran pretended to study but spent most of his time sneaking glances at Ian. "You know," Kieran began, tapping his pen against his notebook, "I'm not sure if I'm jealous of that book or offended by how much attention you're giving it." Ian didn't even look up. If you studied half as much as you flirt, you might actually pass your exams. Kieran smirked, leaning back in his chair. I'll have you know I'm a master of multitasking. For example, I'm currently acing the art of admiring you and pretending to care about molecular biology. Ian finally glanced up, the corner of his mouth twitching. You're impossible. And you're adorable when you're annoyed, Kieran shot back. Ian sighed, though the slight color in his cheeks gave him away. Do you ever stop talking? Not when I'm around you. Gotta keep you entertained, Kieran quipped. Try silence for a change, Ian suggested dryly. Kieran grinned but complied, sitting back and watching Ian work. Though he stayed quiet, the warmth in his chest told him he was exactly where he wanted to be. Later that evening, they found themselves at a quiet cafe near campus. Ian had agreed, albeit reluctantly, to grab dinner after their study session. As they waited for their food, Kieran decided to take a leap. You know, I wasn't always this charming, Kieran began, his tone uncharacteristically serious. Ian raised an eyebrow. Hard to imagine. I'm serious, Kieran said, leaning forward. This whole confident, edgy persona, it's a bit of an act. Ian looked skeptical but intrigued. An act? Kieran shrugged, toying with the rim of his coffee cup. Growing up, I wasn't exactly popular. I was the kid who stuck out. Too loud, too different. Somewhere along the way, I figured out that if I acted like nothing could hurt me, people stopped trying to hurt me. Ian studied him for a moment, his expression softening. That must have been hard. Kieran gave him a small, self-deprecating smile. It was. But it also made me who I am. And honestly, I don't mind putting on a show if it means making people laugh or feel something. Ian hesitated, then said quietly, You don't have to act around me, you know. Kieran's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by the sincerity in Ian's voice. Noted. For a moment, the space between them felt intimate, almost fragile. Kieran realized that this was what he'd been working toward, not just getting Ian to like him, but building something real. The next day, they were walking across campus when a group of Ian's classmates approached. Kieran instantly noticed the shift in Ian's posture, the way he folded in on himself slightly. Well, if it isn't Ian Reed, one of the classmates drawled, their tone dripping with mockery. Still the teacher's pet, huh? Ian's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Kieran, however, wasn't about to let it slide. Is that jealousy I hear? Kieran said, stepping forward and flashing a disarming smile. Because if I were you, I'd be taking notes from Ian. The guy's brilliant. The group exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not expecting Kieran's boldness. Who even are you? One of them asked. Me? Kieran grinned, draping an arm over Ian's shoulder. I'm the guy who doesn't tolerate nonsense from people who can't keep up with him. Ian's cheeks flushed as the group shuffled away, clearly uncomfortable. Once they were gone, Kieran turned to Ian with a smug expression. See? Problem solved. You didn't have to do that, Ian muttered, though there was a faint smile tugging at his lips. Sure I did, Kieran replied. Nobody messes with my... He stopped short, realizing he was about to say something far too revealing. Ian raised an eyebrow. Your... what? Kieran hesitated for a beat, then smirked. My library study partner, obviously. Ian shook his head but didn't push further. Deep down, though, he felt a warmth he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. As the weeks passed, their time together became more frequent. Kieran continued to balance his playful charm with moments of genuine kindness, and Ian found himself softening in ways he hadn't anticipated. One evening, they ended up at Ian's dorm, sharing takeout while a classic sci-fi movie played in the background. Kieran, ever the talker, kept making ridiculous commentary about the plot, much to Ian's exasperation. You know, Ian said, barely suppressing a laugh, I didn't think it was possible to ruin a perfectly good movie, but you're proving me wrong. Kieran feigned offense. I'm enhancing it. Besides, this whole spaceship thing is completely unrealistic. It's a science fiction movie, Ian pointed out. It's not supposed to be realistic. Details, Kieran replied, leaning back and stretching his arms dramatically. By the way, you should know I only tolerate this genre because I like you. Ian paused, his chopsticks hovering mid-air. You like me? Kieran met his gaze, his usual smirk softening into something more sincere. I thought that was obvious by now. Ian looked down, his expression unreadable. You're persistent, I'll give you that. Only because you're worth it, Kieran said softly. Despite the growing connection between them, Ian couldn't shake the nagging voice in the back of his mind, warning him, reminding him of past pain. As much as he enjoyed Kieran's company, the fear of history repeating itself loomed large. One night, as they sat in a quiet park overlooking the city skyline, Ian finally voiced his doubts. Kieran, what if this doesn't work? Kieran turned to him, startled. What do you mean? I mean, Ian hesitated, struggling to find the right words. What if I let myself trust you and I end up regretting it? Kieran's expression softened, and he reached over, gently brushing Ian's hand with his fingers. I can't promise I'll be perfect, Ian, but I can promise I won't give up on you. Ian looked at him, conflicted. Part of him wanted to believe Kieran, to take the leap, but the scars of the past still lingered. Kieran seemed to sense this and didn't push further, instead choosing to simply sit with Ian, offering silent reassurance. That night, as Kieran walked Ian back to his dorm, he couldn't help but feel a new determination take root. Ian might be guarded, but Kieran knew that trust was earned, not demanded. Good night, Ian, Kieran said softly as Ian turned to unlock his door. Good night, Ian replied, hesitating for just a moment before slipping inside. As the door closed, Kieran stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, and smiled to himself. He was in this for the long haul, because for the first time in a long time, Kieran knew he'd found someone worth fighting for.